Well, thanks for being so obedient. For our legislative panel, we're proud to have Renee Shaw from Kentucky Educational Television to be our moderator once again this year. Ms. Shaw is a public affairs managing producer for KET and the host of the popular show Connections, where she regularly, like every week, moderates discussions of Kentucky's most difficult political issues. She's a graduate of Western Kentucky University with a master's in organizational communication, which is what I hope we're going to be doing today. And she's going to attempt to manage, not in order, but Senator Carpenter, the chairman of the Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee, Jim Gooch, who's the chairman of the House Natural Resources and Energy Committee, Kate Shanks, who's the director of the Public Affairs for the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce and a former member of our cabinet, and Tom FitzGerald, who's the director of the Kentucky Resources Council, and me. And so now, Renee.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. It's a pleasure to be here the second year in a row, so I think we got a pretty good gig going here, Mr. Secretary, so I'm glad to be here. We're going to have an abbreviated Kentucky Tonight discussion, if you will, about energy, and I'm so glad to be able to moderate this great panel. I have to put my spectacles on. I'm at that age where I cannot see a certain print. I'm going to start with Mr. Secretary. We're going to talk about the legislative session past and the one to come. So if you'll just talk to us about the 2018 legislative session, some things that the cabinet was able to accomplish, and then we'll have a conversation down the road.
Did you have to start with me?
I do, because you're the big guy.
God, I have to remember what we did this past year.
Well, yeah.
I swear I'm drawing a blank. And I hate to do this in front of all these people that work for me, but...
You want me to come back to you on that?
Yeah, why don't you come back to me?
Okay, very good.
So thank you.
Yeah, I'm very flexible that way.
Good.
I mean, it's just like television, just go with it. Let's just... No,
just me.
And you don't get to use a lifeline, okay? No lifelines. Yeah. Well, we get punchy after 3, don't we? Or close to 3. Okay, so let's go to the chairman. Chairman Gooch and Senator Chairman Carpenter. I don't know which one wants to go first. Okay, Chairman Gooch. This is fun. Let's talk about, do you want to talk about what was accomplished in the 2018 session before I really bring up the 2 bills that didn't pass that might be of particular interest to the audience?
Well, I think some of the things that we did, and the governor mentioned it earlier, was talking about all the regulations and red tape and streamlining the agency that we've done, and that was thanks to Secretary Snavely. And they removed a lot of boards that maybe weren't meeting or commissions that weren't meeting. Kind of got rid of some regulations that really hadn't had any type of action or anything for many, many years. And so I think that's a good thing, because we have way too many regulations on the books. A lot of them aren't really current. And so we did do a lot of streamlining, cutting some of that red tape. And I think that's probably the most productive thing that I think that we did in the session.
Can everyone hear Chairman Gooch?
No.
Okay, so audio, maybe if you can help us out a little bit. I know I'm struggling to hear you just from right here, but that could say something about me. I don't know. Senator Carpenter, Chairman Carpenter, do you want to add to that? I might want to bring it up a little closer to your mouth, Chairman Gooch. Maybe that'll help. Okay, thank you, sir.
I would think that one of the issues that we worked on, it was kind of the same red tape regulation, was with the Oil and Gas Association, and Tom worked with us a lot with that division, and we were able to streamline some of the issues, and I think we've created a better bill this year to improve that process, because we've been so much stuff's going on in the gas industry now. And so I think that was a bill that we like to have. We always talk about trying to bring all the players to the table. And that group has really done an excellent job in being able to bring all the players to the table. I wish we could say that with a lot of more other bills that we've been able to work on this year. And we're trying to do that with some of the ones you're probably going to talk about here in a second that we weren't as successful to complete. But I think they're kind of the model of how we really need to handle an issue and bring all players to the table and try to come to some kind of resolution. Everybody's not going to be happy with how we get there, but I think the end result is the main process. And I think that was one of our main goals. I think think we had a productive session in the energy environment. You know, I think with the regulations that are coming down at the federal level now, it's much easier for us here at the state level to kind of follow along and say, hey, they've got the ship headed in the right direction.
Right. I want to go to Mr. FitzGerald and ask you about that, about the session, and about, we'll talk about the things that you lobbied against that didn't make it, but the things that were accomplished, give us your perspective.
Well, you know, if you look at the media coverage, the passion about pension issues really dominated not only you know, the sound and the fury. I was actually carrying a sign saying, "I am nobody important, please don't yell at me," because people thought I was a legislator. But we really did accomplish some things, and both of the chairs should be proud of that, as well as Secretary Snavely. The Voluntary Environmental Remediation Program, which is a way of clearing up old Superfund and brownfield sites, not federal Superfund, but old moderately contaminated sites and old industrial sites. It hasn't been used the way we all wanted it to be, because there were some things in it that seemed probably made people a little gun shy about wanting to subscribe to the program. So that was streamlined without weakening any environmental protections. The reorganizations of the EEC were affected, consolidation of the nature preserves programs and the Wild River programs, which are things that, you know, given the budgetary cuts that this agency has suffered over the years, you're trying to do is what you need to with a whole lot less, and with each employee costing a whole lot more because of the change in the ARC and the pension. So, but we also had the modernization of the oil and gas, and a lot of credit has to go to the Oil and Gas Association, the big and small producers that really have stepped up. We've accomplished more with the leadership in the House and Senate in the past 6 years than we had done in the past 20. And that redounds to everybody's benefit, to the landowners, to the lessees, and to the producers. So there was a lot accomplished. You know, the pipeline safety penalties were enhanced, which puts us in good stead with the feds in terms of pipeline safety. And even the issue of net metering, which did not go through, and 811, which I think will come back,
talk about that, yes.
Needs to come back. I've never been prouder of the General Assembly that the individual members engaged on an issue the way that they engaged on the distributed generation and the net metering issues. It's a small part of a much larger issue about keeping utilities healthy and keeping rates moderate. But it was an interesting, even though we were not able to come to agreement on it, I've never seen the legislature more engaged in a very technical issue.
Right.
And more, you know, and so that was really, I was very proud of both of the committees of jurisdiction for the amount of time and effort and thought, and certainly for the chairs for the way that they managed a very difficult issue.
Yeah. Ms. Shanks, will come to you. Welcome. I think last year we had Dave Atkinson, but it's nice to have you. It's nice to have another female on the panel, too.
Girl power.
Girl power. So we're glad about that. So from the Chamber's perspective, and this is your wheelhouse, your assessment of the 2018 session when it comes to energy issues.
So I would say it's probably the most intense definitely the most intense legislative session I've ever experienced. And this was already mentioned, it was incredibly controversial. I've never seen so many people packed in the Capitol working on issues, not specifically energy issues, but working on other issues that then made energy issues, I think, even more difficult to tackle. You have so much going on, our legislators have so much that they're distracted by, there's so much controversy, and then, you know, I think in any legislative session, there's only so much you can really take on, there's only so much controversy you can deal with. At the end of every legislative session, you're just done. And you're ready to go home and you're ready to pack up, and what you got done is what you got done. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but as a member of the Kentucky Oil and Gas Work Group, the Kentucky Chamber has been a member of it for years. It is really the bright star on work group and doing consensus building and developing policy and regulations, working with stakeholders. And we've really appreciated the opportunity to be a part of that. That's something that was started years ago. Secretary Snavely has kept it going. It seems like every year there's a bill that gets filed, I guess because there's just so much work that needs to be done, and then during the interim we promulgate regulations, and so it's this constant churn of modernizing, you know, the statutes and the regulations for that industry. So we were really happy to work on, I think it was Senate Bill 249 this year. to deal with the administrative hearings process and to roll that in for oil and gas, and I think that was truly a bright spot. We passed a lot of very important pro-business legislation. I won't go into details on that. I know it's an energy conference, but in spite of the controversy and in spite of the intensity, it was an incredibly productive legislative session all around.
Yeah. Secretary Snavely, you got your, you remember now, right?
Thank you. I want to talk about something a little that related to what Chairman Gooch said, that I think one of the more important things we did, we've talked about red tape reduction and efficiency, and that, might be perceived to be that's, is a negative direction to be going when your mission is to protect the environment. So I want to talk a little bit about the land stewardship. So we had the State Nature Preserves Commission, which is a small group, staffing-wise, 15, 17 people that are charged with protecting the most fragile resources that we have in the Commonwealth. And separately, because it happened in, it was somebody else's idea, a different legislative agenda, we developed the Wild Rivers Program, which had one staff member, but it was a statutory program. And then separately, we had the Heritage Land Conservation Fund. So these were 3 different programs that were being managed in 3 different agencies, because Wild Rivers was in Division of Water and Heritage Land was operated out of DNR. And so it wasn't efficient. And it was and the State Nature Preserves Commission was like separate and independent, which that happens, is very common in state government, is that you have government by boards or commissions. And so it wasn't efficient. So, and the result of that was that we had, every agency was sort of in need of funding, and so we were poor and we were like disorganized, and really we pulled with this statute, pulled all of those together, and I think the result has been terrific. We've got more staff, we've got more money coming in because our people have been very aggressive about going out and getting work, getting grants, and our nature preserves, I think, are in better shape. And so I think that it's a win-win. It's more cost-effective and it's more effective both.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about a couple of the bills that Mr. FitzGerald mentioned, the 811 bill and also net metering. So Chairman Gooch, I think net metering is your personal favorite, isn't it, sir?
Oh God, we're going to talk about net metering again.
Oh, we're going to talk, it's like we did that last year, right? Secretary Snavely, like, this is the last time she's going to moderate this panel. I know, this is an issue, we talked about it on Kentucky Tonight. It consumed a lot of time when we discussed it as well. But it was a big issue in the 2018 session, and there was some, I think, good conversation. And I think maybe it got to a point where there was some compromise, perhaps. I don't know if that's the way that Mr. FitzGerald would characterize it. But Chairman Gooch, kind of take us through that journey of where it started and where it left off, and is that where you're going to pick it up in 2019 when it comes to net metering?
Well, let me just say that net metering, I think, is kind of systemic of what I consider to be an overall problem with the way that we're looking at energy going forward. And what we did is we passed a net metering law several years ago that encouraged people to put rooftop solar on their houses. And that if they did, and of course there'd be times when they would generate excess electricity that they didn't use, and we mandated that the utility companies then would buy that back from them at the exact same price that they had sold it to them from it. Now, let's talk just a minute about where I think this is a much bigger problem. We have to make sure that we have a resilient, reliable grid. And we know that in order to supply that grid, we have to have baseload electricity that's generated by, a baseload generator that has fuel source on site. And traditionally that's been coal with the coal stockpile, or that's been nuclear with the nuclear rod inside the reactor is the fuel source. Even hydro, the water behind the dam, is the fuel source. And we have to have that. Historically, we know that in times of peak demand, when you have to have that electricity It's those baseload generators that you depend on to provide that electricity. And what's happening with laws like net metering and other sources of distributed generation, what we are doing is through subsidies, we are encouraging people to go toward a certain type of fuel for their electricity to be generated. Now, some of these sources like wind and solar are they're just part-time. They're maybe 20% efficient or whatever. Natural gas is a just-in-time fuel. It goes through a pipeline and it arrives at the power plant just in time to generate electricity. But if there's ever any disruption, there's no fuel on site to generate that electricity. And one of the things that I'm really concerned about is that we know that in peak generating times, like when it's 95 degrees outside and it's really hot, the wind isn't blowing, or the peak time for heat when it's 1 o'clock in the morning and it's 5 degrees below zero, the sun's is not shining. So I'm a little concerned that we have policies where we provide subsidies that encourage people to go to certain things like solar and wind and other things that may be beneficial to them, but we may not be considering whether somebody else is having to pay a little extra for that. And then the other thing is that, like we have these baseload generators that are sitting there. They run 85% efficient, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. And what's happening is we're buying wind and solar first. So if they're available, then we're buying those. So what we may be doing is we may be having let's say a coal-fired generator that's designed to run at 85% capacity, and we may be ratcheting it back to 50% or 60% or whatever, just because we have this other renewable source available. Now, I think what we have to understand is that may not be very efficient. It certainly isn't cost effective, but it also may damage the life of the unit that's designed to run 85%. You're only allowed to run 40, 50% or whatever, but also we're doing some things like often because of subsidies, we're actually selling wind in some places onto the grid at a negative price, so actually below zero. And that sounds like that's a pretty good deal for some folks, but it's only because of the subsidy. And what may happen then is that if that power plant is sitting there running and they're not selling electrons, they're not recovering the cost of that, and we may be making those facilities not viable. And we've already seen 40% of the coal fleet in the United States has either been closed or it's been announced that it's going to close. And so we have to make sure that the other facilities that we're going to have to depend on there for a resilient, a reliable grid, that we're not doing things that make them less viable. And I think in a way that net metering is not so much, but it's still part of that distributed generation that, you see companies out there that are corporations that maybe they want to put solar or they want to do wind, they want to generate some of their own electricity, and I'm okay with that. But when they still want to continue to be connected to the grid, so when those things aren't generating, we want to make sure that they're paying their full cost to continue to be connected to the grid. Now, if they want to, totally go, solar or wind or whatever, or renewables, they want to buy their own battery storage or whatever so they can have the power there. They want to disconnect from the grid. I don't have a problem with that. But when they want to stay connected to the grid so they have a backup and they're not buying those electrons most of the time, we got to make sure that they're paying their fair share of the grid so they're not passing that cost on to somebody else.
Yeah, so Mr. FitzGerald, before I come to Chairman Carpenter, that argument of subsidizing electric customers, subsidizing solar customers was one of the things we heard a lot about. So do you have a rebuttal to that commentary?
I think the chairman's right. The issue of rooftop solar is a very, very small part of a much larger discussion that needs to be had, and that is how to assure that we provide lowest cost energy consistent with the reality of climate change and having to adapt rather than simply to respond to try to prevent some of the damage that the most recent IOGC report indicated is already becoming evident. I think that the DOE study 2017 said the impact of giving credit to rooftop solar customers at the same value that they are purchasing power has a minuscule effect and will continue to do so in a place like Kentucky. Hawaii is somewhat a different picture. But one of the issues that has really emerged over the last year that is a much larger issue for the utilities is the improvement in battery storage. Because there you're looking at and there are some cases in front of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission right now on whether a company who has distributed generation and battery storage, how you account for that battery storage. Is it a separate generating unit, or are they eligible under the Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act? So a lot of issues about storage. We do have one of our congressmen who is completely grid disconnected because he has combined his rooftop solar with his panels. And there may come a time, depending on the development of that technology, when the utilities will be urging those distributed customers to stay part of the grid rather than attempting to punish them for being part of the grid. So it's an important issue. The question of subsidy requires that you look at the cost and the benefit that's provided by having distributed generation. And unfortunately, we've not been able to get the parties to sit down together and try to come up with some commonality and some common understanding of what are the costs and what are the benefits and how you weigh them. And so there have been different approaches that have been tried over the years. None have been successful yet, but it's not for the want of effort on the part of both of these committee chairs, because they have really attempted, I think, to try to understand the issues. Certainly there's been a lot of time that has been given to those who have differing perspectives. And I hope that we'll continue to work on it. It's a small piece of a much larger puzzle of how you assure affordable rates, reliable energy, as the chairman said, but also how you keep utilities whole when they have declining per capita demand, and so much of their fixed costs are on the volumetric side. And so there's a number of issues there that really need to be grappled with. And so we look forward to continue that conversation.
Secretary Snavely, did you want to comment?
I've taken a position in this debate, and I do think that there is subsidization. I'm going to shift and say that I think a much bigger issue, although this is a very emotional issue, quantitatively it's not a huge issue in Kentucky. The fact that we're using less electricity than we have in the past, I think, is a huge issue. And that's why you even heard the governor start to suggest that the only way we're going to increase electricity usage is to electrify our vehicles. So that's a market share issue, but I think it would have more impact on the citizens than any other electricity related issue, because we socialize our cost of electricity. All the citizens, if you're in KU, in that KU area, you pay for the cost of operating that system. So when you have less usage, the price goes up. And so we're seeing that in the rural areas, both in the eastern and the western part of the states, and it's hugely emotional. You think net metering is emotional. The price of electric bills in Kentucky Power is more emotional than that.
And we heard some of that during the
And it's
session
because
as well.
largely because we don't have as much usage of electricity as we used to.
Right. I want you to comment on that, Chairman Carpenter, and also net metering, and if there is a working group on net metering. If we know oil and gas, there's been success in having that kind of discussion in a working group fashion. Would this also benefit from the same?
Well, that's kind of what discussions I've had, is we need a working group, and we've tried to bring the parties together. And net metering to the average person, average citizen, or average person in the legislative body, they're like, whatever you say, Jared, we don't know what net metering is, because it gets really complicated.
Right.
And Jim and I have spent a tremendous amount of time, and it's like Secretary Snavely said, it's such a small number of Kentucky citizens that's on it, you would assume that's not very controversial. But once you start bringing it to the table, you realize people are like, I don't know if they're here to complain about pensions or they're complaining about net metering. And I told some of the solar installers that they've kind of took a corner in my office some days. I've told them I think they've rallied together they're changing T-shirts in the middle of our session day just to show support for each other. But honestly, the issue has just been to try to educate folks about it, because it really does have an impact for electricity prices. And you also want to protect the businesses that have evolved in Kentucky that provide this service. And there's a certain sector of people who want this service and are willing to pay for it. And so my job, or my philosophy was during this session, was after Chairman Gooch really worked a lot on it to get it to my side. And Kate's exactly right. Everybody, your palate kind of gets full of stuff that tastes bad after a little while. And toward the end of the session, members were starting to shut down. And this issue was on the floor one of the last few nights in the Senate, and we just couldn't get to where we needed to get everybody comfortable. And I didn't want to push it because I felt it was too big of an issue to throw out something that we couldn't be proud of at the end of the day. And I think that with Tom's help, I think we can continue to bring the utilities, they've been at the table, and the solar installers together to get some kind of compromise. We got really close. We got some language to say that we're going to grandfather people in that have that system now. We're going to protect the installers, protect that industry, but also not charge people who doesn't want that product, make sure they're not paying for the folks that do want the product. Right. And so we're getting really close. I think this would be a session, if Jim wants to sponsor it. No, no, I think this is a session that we might actually, we're going to get closer with it, because I've been there 8 years now. Renee, you and I talked about this over there on the side just a little while ago. But in my 8 years, there's nothing that's come on that's a tough issue that gets done the first year and is over with. It takes time, it takes education, and it takes people's engagement to realize what needs to be done to make sure we get something out that we can be proud of that's the right product.
And in your district, you have lots of solar interests in your district.
I do, yeah.
So you've heard it from both sides.
Absolutely. I saw when I went back, I kind of felt like the same people that were in the office up there were back in my district, because Berea has a really big solar installation, and Kentuckians for the Commonwealth are really big into it. And I just want to be what's fair, and that's what I wanted to do with the solar. I'm a small business guy, and I didn't want to see us drive a business that's really become prosperous here in Kentucky to employ a number of people. I didn't want to see us drive that out. And Tom is exactly right. The battery issue, he brought it up in my committee, and I said, they're producing these batteries now. They've got a factory now that's doing it in Pikeville. And so this is going to become a player that's going to be the next concern. Are you worried about losing these customers? Right. So I'm hoping I'll take this time to say I want and I see where the utilities and the solar folks, they're over here sitting pretty close to each other. So that's a good sign.
That's a good sign.
We want to make sure that
they're waiting for that working group.
That's exactly right. We want to continue to see them do that work group to where we can have a consensus, because I've told those guys that the oil and gas work group is exactly what we want them to be.
Right. Is it Interblue in Pikeville? Is that the name of the company?
It is, yeah. That's right.
Right. I was struggle to remember that. So Chairman Gooch, kind of put it on you. 2019, are you going to go back and pre-file this bill after this conference?
I'm not sure. I want to talk with folks and make sure if someone else wants to do it, I would be happy. Or sometimes if it starts in the Senate, I might be okay with that. But let me just say that one of the reasons, we're all proud of Interblue and what's happening there. But when the utility company is acting as your battery storage pretty much, then there's no reason for anybody to buy batteries. And that's what I have a problem with their net metering bill, is that you're not going to buy a battery when you can sell it back to the utility. Right. They give you the exact same cost and then give it back to you later. There's no reason to even think about buying batteries.
So let's move on to the 811 calls, Bill. And this kind of fell off my radar, I think, like you said, Kate was saying, the bandwidth, so much of that was taken up with pension, and you're in a budget year. So there's, even from the media perspective, there's only so much you can wrap your mind around. And I think that 811 probably did not get on my radar. So kind of bring me up to speed on that, so I'll be better informed for the next session if this is actually an issue that may come up in 2019.
Well, 811, I don't care to start this because I'm in a development business and I'm in the construction industry, so it's an important part of what I do. 811 is a service that provides utility location. If you're going to
call before you dig.
Call before you dig. You see the advertisement. And so in Kentucky, not all utility members have to be a member of the 811 call before you dig organization. some of our small utility companies and municipals or even gas companies are not part of that membership. And the membership is very small. I can't remember the dollar figure now, but it's like 25 cents or 10 cents per call. In other words, if I'm out as a contractor going to dig on one of my properties, I call and say, hey, I'm going to dig. I need you to come locate some utility lines. Well, they'll come and locate them, and you find out they just located 3 of the 6 that were there because there was a water line, maybe a gas line, and another utility that wasn't a part of this membership. You go out there to dig, and you hit it, and it's your responsibility to get it fixed. And the whole point of that is a one-stop shop. It's more business friendly for guys like me that's out in the field, and it's also for people who are coming outside of the state lines, because other communities around, other states around us, you call the one person and they locate them all. And so that's another issue. You would have thought that would have been a simple fix. Everybody would be on board with it and say, oh, okay, it's a small charge, let's do it. Because a lot of these local utilities, they don't have the manpower to answer the phone and say, I need to get this done. And they don't come out for 3 or 4 days when you're needing it to be done in maybe the next 24 hours. Well, the utilities, the small rural utilities, they lost their mind, I think, a little bit, because they did not want to be engaged in this process. And utilities in my district called me and like, what are you trying to do, Jared? I'm like, why would we not want to do this? It simplifies the process. And a lot of it, I think, come down to the simple fact that some of these rural utilities had no clue where their lines are. And so they'd rather you're the guinea pig. You get to find where their line is when I dig that excavator in the ground. And it's not real forgiving. And so it becomes my responsibility. And so I think that was one of the biggest issues, and we've got some work on it. Senator Hornback has really pushed that issue. He and I both worked a lot on it during the session, and I think he's getting close now during the interim of getting something resolved on it. And a lot of people have called me in the meantime. Gary, with the rural utilities, has really been active on saying, that he knows he needs to get some of his members in line to participate in it. So I think we're getting closer on it.
Yeah, Mr. Secretary.
Yeah, I'll give you some background on it, because I think it got on our radar through the Public Service Commission, where we found out that although most, if not all, gas utilities are participate in this 811, we had reports of 1,600 to 1,700 times per year that someone was cutting into a gas line. Well, that's a safety issue. So we took it up as a safety issue, and the legislation that was actually passed gave the PSC enforcement authority. So what I saw was there's 2 problems with this, because more and more utilities are being placed underground. I mean, Melissa Duff and I just had a discussion in the break about high voltage electric being put in the ground. You don't want to cut into that. So it's an important issue. But there were 2 things. One is because 811 is called, one call does it all, call before you dig. It's on all of their big, nice new pickup trucks. People think that that's the law, even though it's not. It's not mandatory. And the second thing is there was not really any enforcement. And I think from utilities I've talked to, enforcement works. And so the PSC is starting to enforce, and people are starting to wake up to it. But it's still a big issue, and you're right. Oddly enough, it wasn't just small utilities. There were some large utilities, but mostly because we did convene a work group. We've had a couple of meetings about this 811 bill with all kinds of stakeholders. It's only water and wastewater utilities that don't want to be members. One, the risk is lower. I mean, the immediate risk, unless you cut into real high pressure. If you cut into wastewater line, it's messy, but it's usually not life-threatening, But gas, electric, telecommunications, it's such a cost issue. Nobody wants you cutting into their fiber line, so they're really on board. So I think that we'll be successful this coming year, but we still have an issue mostly with the small water and wastewater utilities that don't want one, they don't know where their lines are, and secondly, they don't want the cost of having to respond to a bunch of calls. They're afraid they're going to get swamped with calls, and they're going to be having to mark lines a lot. It's a cost issue.
Right. Mr. FitzGerald.
I was going to say that's a great segue into one of the issues that I think is going to be facing the 2019 session, and that is wastewater and water infrastructure funding. We have a lot of systems out there, some of the very same systems that have only a vague idea of where all the lines are. You also have a significant amount of water loss in a lot of those systems. You have systems that are not financially viable. And then, of course, you have the issue that the legislature addressed in part during the last session of what happens when you have a failing wastewater system. So, you know, the infrastructure needs are there. The question is how you develop a combination of grant and loan programs that are able to allow small communities that are financially strapped for a number of other reasons unrelated to this infrastructure. How do they maintain the level of service that we think all Kentuckians deserve to have? So that's one of those issues that I think a couple of the initiatives ran out of time during the last session, but I know Senator Humphreys was actively involved, and there were members in the House as well who are looking at how do we deal with those infrastructure needs for water and wastewater. And so it is emblematic, I think, of that larger.
Was that the original SB 151?
We're not even going to go there.
Sorry.
We're not even going to, yes, that was, yes. Optics being what they were, would you really want to take a wastewater bill and turn it into your pension bill?
Right.
I mean, I'm just.
Yeah, just saying. Chairman Gooch, and then I'll come to Ms. Shanks.
Yeah, let me just say about the 811, I understand that when we advertise to people that if you call 811 that we want to, it's much better if everyone's a member. You know, I had to do some construction at my house a little bit ago, and you know, I live in the city and they have their own electric distribution and water and sewer, and I called them and they came out and flagged the lines or whatever. But I think one of the things we want to make sure is that I think the cost may be a little bit more than what the Senator mentioned, and some of the small utilities do think that's going to be a pretty big cost. And then you have this board that is kind of oversees this, and I'm not sure that it's made to be quasi-government. It may be private. And you know, when we start mandating that people pay into a service, we want to make sure that we have transparency to see who's over that board and you know where the money's being spent and those sort of things as well. And so I think that's something that we're also going to have to work on if we start mandating that everyone has to be a member of the 811 system.
Ms. Shanks, is this on the Kentucky Chamber's legislative list for 2019?
Well, 811 is something we're certainly following. We have a lot of members that care a lot about this. I mean, imagine hitting fiber, hitting a gas line, hitting water and wastewater lines. So it's something that we'll be engaged on. I appreciate Secretary Snavely starting another work group. We keep your staff busy. We like them too. And I attended his meeting on that, and it seems like there's a lot of varying issues on it. I appreciate Tom mentioning water and wastewater. I actually talked about that at this conference last year. We had just published our infrastructure report. $6.2 billion needed in wastewater and water infrastructure, both separately, 6.2 each, that's the word each, in investment in new water and wastewater infrastructure. And for us at the Chamber, this is a very important economic development issue. If we don't have the capacity for your new facility to tap on, they're not going to come to your community, whether you're a more rural area or you're in a more urban area. And so if we tackle legislation, we would like to see some sort of incentive mechanism, consideration for voluntary consolidation of water and wastewater services. Maybe the days of each individual community having their own system, maybe that needs to be replaced with something that's more consolidated. And then we also worked really hard a few years ago to pass P3 legislation, public-private partnership legislation, and we know that there's some, certainly some private investment available that we can use to build larger systems, more productive systems, and really tackle this issue. It's probably not the most, I think it's exciting, but it's probably not the most exciting issue that's going to come before the legislature in 2019. I don't know that it's going to bring out everybody in their T-shirts and their stickers for that, but it's certainly something we'd like to work on. We'd like to work with the chairman, with Tom, and of course the secretary, and see how we can really tackle this issue, because this isn't something that we're going to be able to address overnight. So hopefully that will become a...
Yeah, the more you defer it, the more...
The worse it gets.
The worse it gets.
Secretary Snavely.
Well, oddly enough, we had a 2-hour debate about this very topic yesterday, and I'm going to credit Mike Schmidt from Public Service Commission, who's sitting right over there, and Talina's here too, and Gwen. I didn't see Gwen, but she's probably here too. But and we had an internal bureaucracy work group, And so we had the Public Service Commission and Division of Water and the Department for Local Government and even Rural Development, who happen to have a lot of money right now. But the issues are so complex with small utilities. One is, well, we don't like them people over there and we don't want them telling us what to do. Two is that with small utilities, you know, they have more difficulties with management. Mm-hmm. And with the willingness to raise rates necessary, heck, the PSC's been telling people to raise rates or giving them more money than they ask for because they need money to keep up these systems. Governor Patton did this infrastructure plan, I think it was called 2020, is that what it was called? It was, okay, we built out the infrastructure, we got plus 95% of people on public drinking water systems. Mm-hmm. What about maintaining it? Right. That's where we're at now, so it's likely that we're going to need to come up with another long-range plan on how we address capital, how we address human resources management, and the scale that's necessary to keep water affordable and to keep it reliable, and no different than electricity. It has to be safe and it has to be reliable because people depend on it. You know, personally, I'd rather be without electricity than without water at home.
Can we get a bottle of water here for Chairman Gooch? Someone could activate, we'd appreciate it. Thank you so much. In the time we have remaining, we have a few more minutes. I want to talk about other legislative agenda items relating to energy and the environment. Mr. FitzGerald, I'll let you go first. What are you already putting your pen to paper on for next year?
If you remember back to last year, then Commissioner and now Deputy Secretary Scott talked about legacy issues, talked about the fact that we have inherited a generation of Superfund sites that will never be eligible for federal money because they don't rank high enough on the MITRE model. We've got fortunately, a declining number of underground storage tank sites because we have been processing a lot of those sites through and getting them remediated. But we still have tremendous number of tank batteries that are associated with oil and gas operations. We have 15,000 or more that we know of, old abandoned wells that need to be plugged and cased. And then we have agencies that traditionally have relied a lot on permitting fees, and where you have less permitting going on, for example, the oil and gas industry, because of the Marcellus and the Utica plays up in the Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia, they still have the obligations to inspect to make sure closure and plugging is occurring properly, yet the income stream is not there to be sustainable. So one of the things that the Cabinet and the work group have been talking about is the potential for reprogramming some of the PSTAF money, the Petroleum Storage Tank Fund money, that is now being sent to the general fund because things are improving economically overall, and making those programs more sustainable, because the regulated as well as the landowners as well as the public benefit from having the agency have the resources it needs to do the job, to do the permitting, the compliance evaluation, the compliance enforcement. And I think we all recognize that. The question is, can we get enough of a consensus among the different folks to program the money that's necessary to assure equitable treatment and efficient permitting and regulation of the various industries? Because it really is, you have you're either going to go to the regulated, which in the case, for example, oil and gas, is a pretty tight margin that they're operating on. There's not a whole lot of opportunity to absorb additional costs. And then you're either going to look to the public or you're going to look to the regulated, or a combination of both. And I think here we have an available source of funds that could be reprogrammed in part to assure that the Cabinet, which has done an amazing job under very difficult financial circumstances over the past 10 years, to assure that they can continue to do the little jobs of protecting the air and land and water and the public.
Yeah. Mr. Secretary.
Well, this is another issue that we've taken up with our stakeholders, and it is our priority piece of legislation. We are not optimistic that we would be well received if we asked for additional funding to do environmental cleanup. So that's the Superfund sites, contaminated sites, orphan landfills, which is another one, and the abandoned oil and gas wells. And all of those are significant, and they affect people all across the Commonwealth. So because of the financial condition of the Commonwealth, the needs that exist in the pension program, in Medicaid, and in the prisons, that's where the money's going in Kentucky. So we don't think that we're pretty low on the totem pole when it comes to funding. So our people have, and Bruce has been a leader of this, is to say the Petroleum Storage Tank Fund is adequate, and it's managed. It needs to continue. And so we've engaged all of our stakeholders to say, we think it's important that we take this, designate a certain piece of that for doing a similar mission, which is rather than the environmental contamination from gasoline tanks, to do other environmental cleanups, because that's what we do and that's what we're good at. And for economic development, it's very important for Kentucky.
Ms. Shanks, are there other agenda items that the Chamber has for 2019 when it comes to energy issues that you'd like to see advance?
Well, obviously, we talked a lot about net metering. We supported that bill. We'd love to see it come back this year. If I were legislator for a day, I know the governor said if he was king for the day. If I was legislator for the day, I would certainly want to work on that issue. It took up a lot of time, a lot of energy, and it would be good to get a resolution on it. And we supported that. We want to bring that back. We mentioned 811, we mentioned water and wastewater. I think this topic that is kind of emerging on brownfields and Superfund sites is going to be one that's going to take some energy and some time. Talked about that last year, how important it is to redevelop our brownfields, and it is an economic development issue. One of the emerging issues for us, though I don't believe this is legislative, it's more regulatory in nature, is dealing with mitigation banks and some of the way that's interpreted with the Army Corps of Engineers. So that's kind of an emerging issue with us at the Kentucky Chamber, and it's been brought to our attention that there's some inconsistencies there, and how that's interpreted. And again, economic development and how we develop land and how we need to have credits when we impact the land. So that's something that we're going to continue to talk about. But I think we've covered the bulk of the issues that we're going to face. There's always something that comes that you don't expect, and there's something non-energy that's coming that nobody sees coming yet, or that maybe we're starting to see. And you have to remember that this is the short session, so it is a sprint. I mean, it's and we do have elections, and we do have leadership, potential changes. So it's going to be a challenge, and we're fortunate to have the leadership we have on energy and environment. And I've said this for years. The legislature in Kentucky is really great to us on energy and environment issues, and we're really fortunate at the Kentucky Chamber to work with our chairman and, of course, with Secretary Snavely on these issues. So
I'll let the chairman get the last word here.
There's not
Mr.
any
Carpenter?
issues that I've seen that's come up that's going to be new, but that's kind of the job as chairman. We're almost firemen at times. We have to put out those fires that come before us when they're really hot, and they get the flames get really reaching to the ceiling. And so as of right now, I think, the A11 and the net metering issue, to continue that process.
You don't see a sleeper issue.
I don't
yet.
right now, not yet, but I'm sure there's one lurking.
Give it time, right? Chairman Gooch.
Well, and I agree with that. I generally try not to have a lot of bills during a short session because, we only got 30 days. And when you take up the first 4 days for the organizational session and you come back, you're looking at, 26 more days. And, when bills have to go through both chambers and they have all the required readings and going to committee and all of that, there's really not a lot of time to do a lot. And so it really causes a problem when everybody wants to refile a bill that didn't get passed the last session. And so I try not to do that. And but there are some that you got really close to getting agreement on, like we did with net metering and those types of things, and 811, that I'm pretty sure those two bills will be back.
Anyone else care to comment before we wrap up?
I was just going to say, the oil and gas work group may have another consensus bill. We're reaching some of the more difficult issues, but one of the things is that the lack of a more nuanced enforcement and compliance ability on the agency means that everything gets the hammer, right? And so there may be some ways to, looking at some of the other programs to provide some more administrative remedies, to keep people in compliance, to keep those who don't want to be in compliance from undercutting the other operators in the marketplace. So we're working on that, and there's some good give and take between the association and the agency and the other stakeholders. So I'm hopeful. We're running a little short on time, but the work group will continue to try to deliver a consensus product rather than taking up the committee's time with, trying to work out things in front of the committee.
Yeah. And Mr. Secretary.
Yeah, I have to say before we go that in several of our different programs, we are in this struggle for finances, that we are reaching a point where it's starting to become difficult to fulfill our mission. And I think everybody in the room, whether you're an electric utility or whether you're on the environmental advocate, or if you're in the legislature, our survival is important to the Commonwealth, and what we do is important, and we've tried to, prioritize what we do. So we've got either draft legislation or having work group discussions on fees, permitting fees, on the ability for the Public Service Commission to retain more of the fees that it already collects from the utilities, because we've just gotten in a habit, and it's not just the legislature, it's just that's what's put in the budget, is to sweep a lot of these funds. And we're, there's like, I don't know, less than 65 people working in the Public Service Commission. All of these utilities depend on them in order to get rate increases. So we're starting to get to the point that's a problem.
Yeah.
So in water, in air, in the Public Service Commission, different areas, we're looking at fees and ways to fund ourselves. We're not trying to line our pockets. We're trying to survive.
Trying to survive.
And we just love work groups that come to consensus, because that does our job for us. And
Absolutely.
That's the way
Sometimes
that's the way we like to have
sometimes it's
things
difficult.
done, really, if
Well,
they
stakeholder
can.
input, right?
That's
That's
right,
what it's all
exactly.
about. And that's how the best legislation gets crafted. Thank you all, and good luck, and see you in 2019 for
Thank
sure.
you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Give them a round of applause.
Wow.